Hello and welcome to our next nuanced neuroscience conversation about the vampires in AMC Plus's The Vampire Lestat, season 3 of what originally started as Interview with the Vampire. We have covered the anterior cingulate cortex of the Vampire Lestat himself. We've covered limbic Louis, limbic plus Daniel, and because I have my own anterior cingulate system that won't entirely let go of things, I'm finishing up with what was originally planned with our temporal Nicola de Lenfent, first love, if not the great love, of the Vampire Lestat himself, so that we can move on to the requested analysis of the Vampire Armand. Very excited for that conversation, but I need to close my own loop. I also want to apologize for the hiatus in content production and publication, that awkward moment when real life practice and real life work just interrupts watching a fantasy show for the sake of neuroscience. And life gets in the way. But here I am, and for the next conversation, my practice partner will join me. We have decided to rename our anatomical practice dummy the Real Rashid, which some people have understood. Some people look at us as if we're slightly nuts. We had previously named the anatomical model Sophie's mom, after Sophie's mom in Carnival. For she is silent and in the background, but knows the things. And since we're a brain-focused practice, we've got a brain-focused dummy there. But that is now the Real Rashid, making a proud, sneaky background appearance in our neuroscience conversations. As usual, everything here is my opinion, and even though I am a neuroscientist and a brain health professional and an elite brain health clinician certified through the Amen University, and a registered counsellor in South Africa, my opinions are not diagnostic of the actors portraying the roles, nor of the roles themselves, for they are fictional characters. Nothing in the video substitutes a consultation with a mental health care or a neuroscientific leaning professional. If anything is triggering or if anything raises questions, support resources will be in the show notes, and we really do encourage you, if anything comes up, to get the information that you need to make the choices that are absolutely best for you and for your mental health and for your brain health, because brain health and body health go together like this. Today we are going to touch on some sensitive topics. So we are going to talk about self-harm. YouTube might have an issue. I don't know how sensitive I have to be on the language, but I'm going to, for my sons, speak as sensitively as I can. In the real world, in the mental health space at the moment, there is a shockwave going on around the United States murder trial of a woman by the name of Lindsay Clancy, who had experienced postpartum depression and psychosis, who may have had an underlying bipolar disorder, and who, following the experience of a command hallucination, terminated her offspring and attempted to do so for herself as well. She failed. So the internet at the moment is very sensitive to language, which irks me deeply because I'm blunt. But I also understand that entertainment channels and entertainment value might be upset by what I say. And even though this is a neuroscience show on vampires, what on earth could be so serious or triggering about that? In my mind, I want to be sensitive to our followers, for whom I'm very grateful, and to anybody new watching. So I'm going to be as careful as I can. If anything is triggering, you are welcome to send a message to the practice so that we can help refer you where you need to go. Our website address with a chat option is going to be in the show notes. If any trauma is brought up, I urge you to seek some assistance, especially through the BWRT International Network, also linked below. It is a neuroscientific method of trauma intervention, which goes literally, bypasses the speech centers, moves and bypasses emotional centers, goes a little bit deeper into the embodied states to resolve trauma. It is a BWRT is a clean procedure, so even if you are in a therapeutic process already, it will not interrupt your therapy, it will probably support it. So if anything comes up and you need support, there will be resources. The reason that I say if anything comes up and you need support, because this is triggering, we are touching on bipolar disorder, even though it is accused by a fictional character, it is used as what could be considered a bit of a slight by a fictional character. It is still something that is experienced in real life, and then we see self-harm, and we see ultimately not a suicidal ideation, but a surrender to the fire, which makes sense neuroscientifically, but understandably could be very upsetting and visceral to somebody, to anybody who has had mood lability, who has not been able to stabilize impulses, and who has experienced the need to inflict bodily harm on themselves. So I have pointed out from the very beginning that I experience Nicky as temporal. And the reason I say that is, first and foremost, he is musical and he is creative and he is physical in how he plays. He's not just standing with the bow. He's embodied in the practice, which means hemispherically through the corpus callosum, he's integrated into the music. Now, while that is wonderful to see, it also means that there is something that takes over the body when there is an emotional connection coupled with a sensory experience. And even though our emotions are in the limbic system primarily, remember what touches the limbic system: that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. But one day when I'm big, I'm going to have the model of the brain from underneath. Structures touch each other, and the limbic system doesn't just live in the center of the brain. The limbic system lives all the way through the brain and touches the temporal lobe. Not just touches, it's integrated, it's part of. You have a left amygdala and a right amygdala, you have a left hippocampus and a right hippocampus. And so when there is temporal dysregulation, the temporal dysregulation, even if it is in the mid-temporal gyrus, eventually, because of location and because of proximity and because structures interact with each other, affects the amygdala, especially during emotional regulation, which is necessary in relation to cognitive control over emotions, which we assume will be managed by the prefrontal cortex. But what touches the frontal lobe? And when we're dealing with an embodied state and a sensory state, we are very much dealing with the supplementary motor area, which touches the temporal part of the brain. And when the body is engaged in an emotional state, and appraisal and reappraisal is not necessarily top priority when we're feeling big feelings, because our emotions are messages for survival a lot of the time. That again comes a little bit lower into the brain where we were speaking before. That means we might lose our ability to have top-down control over a situation. Top down. That means we lose our efficacy in tuning into the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which allows for the inhibition of behavior and the inhibition of emotion when we reappraise a situation. So there's the first appraisal, which is reticular activation, which is bottom up, which is what is going on, what am I feeling, sensory and motor, especially in a body that is fully engaged with the world around it. Now, when there is mood lability, and we have a lot of research that connects the mood lability of bipolar disorder with temporal lobe dysregulation. So this is something that is a known event, especially when there is either hyper recruitment or blunted activation, overactivation or underactivation. Either way, dysregulation is dysregulation. And whether that happens in the supplementary motor area or in the mid-temporal gyrus, it affects emotional regulation, and it decreases the person's ability to not suppress, but attenuate the volume of the messages being given by the amygdala, for example. And that means the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex do not have their usual efficacy in pushing through rational, reasonable thought and action. That means when there is an experience of anger, it might switch to rage, and it might even switch to a blackout, where there is an impulse and a mood control problem, because we lose focus, we lose forethought, and it becomes almost like a shotgun array of chaos. It can also become incredibly focused on one thing. So again, it's whether it is hyper-recruited or hypo-recruited, depending on the area. Now, we know that hypofrontality has been coupled with certain symptoms of schizophrenia. Certain symptoms of schizophrenia are also coupled with temporal lobe dysregulation, much in the same way as bipolar disorder is, especially when it comes to mania and psychosis. Now, this is why it is a sensitive topic, because at the moment we are dealing with a case where psychosis led to somebody committing an atrocious act. Actually 4 atrocious acts, 3 against others, 1 and a bit against herself. So I want to take a second to just explain what happens when the part of your brain that knows you, the part of the brain that understands the value of who you are in the moment, with all of your characteristics and your passions and your being, almost your soul. When that part is inhibited, it is possible to move into a state of being out of touch with the reality that you used to know, with the reality that is your baseline. The reason losing touch with the reality that is your baseline is a temporal issue is because the temporal lobes, in the medial aspect of the temporal lobes, the hippocampus, the declarative, the narrative, the semantic memory center of the person sits. And dysregulation, either over or under, can lead to a level of dissociation from the remembered self, the storied self. It can also lead to a dissociation from perception of the world around oneself, such as visual processing and facial recognition. Capgras syndrome is neurologic, as much as it is a syndrome that psychiatrists treat as psychosis. There is a neurological, physiological, neuroanatomical reason for it, and it is when the underside of the temporal lobes, either over or under fire, where people you have known your whole life just no longer look right. And they're not imposters, but they look wrong. So there's a perceptual issue, which is physiological first and foremost, before it is psychotic. But the dysregulation of the brain system leads to the behavior and the experience of detachment and dissociation from reality. Now, that means as much as we want people to be able to cognitively appraise things appropriately and cognitively reappraise things appropriately, the part of the brain that does that isn't working right. It's asking somebody with a broken leg to run on the leg while it is actively broken. It is not possible without intervention, without managing that part of the brain. Now, in the Vampire Lestat, Nicky goes into what I, without diagnosing, just on observation, might relate to a manic spiral, looking for his letter opener and looking in the chamber pot that has urine in it and having this conversation about where he left it, and he needs to give the letter opener purpose. Now that might be a delusion, a fixed false belief, but he's in there. He needs to give it purpose. What is the purpose? We don't know, but we can assume from what he does with the axe that the purpose is to separate himself from the problem part of himself. Now, that is related to Cotard syndrome, where you experience either your whole self or parts of yourself as being dead or dying or rotting. It is complex, but it is temporal. And he says, my hands are much older than I am. And he relates all of the problems that he is having on an interpersonal level with Lestat, with the coven, with playing his violin at the shows of the Théâtre des Vampires. He relates all of it back to his hands being the problem. And he continues to separate the problem from himself, giving the axe purpose and being firmly convinced that that is the problem. And the reason that I touch on psychosis and delusion here is because he then takes the axe to Lestat and says, I need you to help me with the other one. And obviously this would hurt. But in a state of psychosis, there's a depersonalization and a derealization where it's not happening to you and your body, and the fact that you're getting rid of the body part that is the problem might be such a relief, because there's no reappraisal. There was a faulty appraisal in the first place. The faulty appraisal means there is no reappraisal, especially with temporal dysregulation. And he follows through and says, please take off the other one. Now, in the book, this is different. But I think how it is portrayed in the show, especially with what is currently going on in the mental healthcare universe, yes, it is fiction, and yes, it is a vampire character. But to take a moment and to just imagine how it must feel to finally find the thing that has been causing all of your problems for almost your whole life, and to think so firmly that this is the solution, and to believe in it so firmly that you ask somebody to help you take off the other one to make it stop, to destroy the organ that caused you the problem. He throws his hand in the fire. He is then, we hear Lestat narrate that Nicky is then pushed into the fire and kept there with a poker. But he's not screaming, he's just making a almost like an om sound there. Not fighting. That's important. We have a self-protective instinct in the brain. It's why even though we might bite, we don't bite and eat ourselves unless there is something incredibly dysregulated. And there is something to a pain stimulus and the temporal lobes. There is something to self-harm and the temporal lobes. There is something to temporal dysregulation that leads to enormously destructive action. Which can be externalized, but more often than not it's internalized, and it's not because of suicidality. It has everything to do with a visceral experience of not being able to touch the logical, the rational, the reasonable parts of the self in order to switch on that top-down regulation component that we have when we are balanced. One would think that such a portrayal is something that is beyond imagination. And again, this is where I look at the show and I go, secretly somewhere here there's a psych person, because practical training in psychiatric settings has provided me with the privilege of meeting people where they're at in that state. My practice partner, similarly, we've met psychosis, we've met mania, we've met manic psychosis, we've met delusions, and we've met temporal dysregulation. There is incredibly tastefully done, but it is real and it is visceral. And if you know somebody, or if you yourself are struggling with anything like that, please consider figuring out if there is something up with your brain systems. The Amen Brain Behavior Systems Checklist is a free resource on the internet. You can take its results straight to your general practitioner, to a psychiatrist, to a neuropsychiatrist, which would be ideal, to a counselor, but to somebody who can then assist in the interpretation, because there is really good, supportive, self-sustainable ways of getting through that absolutely incredibly distressing dysregulation. An interesting, self-sustaining, useful, supportive management for temporal lobe regulation is a ketogenic diet. It was originally designed to support schizophrenic patients. The study was longitudinal, and over time, symptoms of schizophrenia, both observable and reported, both positive and negative symptoms, diminished with just eating appropriately. Now, when it comes to temporal dysregulation, more often than not, there is a need for medication. But, and this is important, something like diet can have an incredible effect. And when it comes to supplementation, GABA, which we make, but we might not have enough. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Vitamin B6 and then omega-3 oil is something that one can figure out to incorporate into a diet. It's a once a day stack, and it works before medication is even consulted. When it comes to medication, often anticonvulsants and anti-epileptic medication, such as Epitech and Lamictal, are used for mood regulation, not just temporal dysregulation. Things like Lyrica, Dilantin also, but self-sustainable is always a good place to start. So when it comes to things like ginkgo biloba to increase blood flow, acetylcholine support, because we need that to help support the hippocampus and memory formation and keeping ourselves in touch with ourselves. There are supplements that do that, and then the supplements, in conjunction with the right diet, in conjunction with the right exercise, in conjunction with the right medication, monitored over time by a clinician, means that this temporal lobe dysregulation is not something that has to be so devastating that it leads to crises, either in a fictional universe for which I have tremendous affection, but in real life as well. I think the current climate of mental health care, especially as it has been put on display and put under a microscope with the trial that is currently happening, reminds me that brain health matters. And even though we need clinicians, we need external support, myself included, the more I am able to do for myself and the more I can have somebody help at home when it comes to diet and exercise and things like that, if it is something that's already there, incorporating the external help is a little bit easier, so that we don't have to hit crisis to get help. You don't have to hit crisis to get help. Now, thank you for your indulgence with Nicola de Lenfent, our first love. We are moving on to the Vampire Amand in the next video. It's going to be exciting. And thank you so much for the requests. Thank you so much for the views and the subscriptions, the comments and the questions. They are incredibly affirming and they are incredibly interesting. So please, I ask your patience as I manage real life and practice life and then this magical universe as well. But thank you very much for your time and your patience, and we will see you soon with the gremlin himself.